Okay, so let us start. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Otto Brun. I'm the chair of UAS for Europe's Management Committee, and I'm here in that function. Thank you for joining us here at this open talk on the European approach to microcredentials. We're very happy to have with us today a speaker, Koen Numden, the team leader for skills and qualifications recognition tools at DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion of the European Commission. We have 1 hour today, so about half an hour for a presentation and half an hour for questions afterwards. I'll be moderating this session, and for the Q&A afterwards, I'll have some help from my colleague Tim Ubelin, who will be joining us after Koen's input, who is the representative of BIFOR, the Bavarian Research Alliance. So quickly about the co-organizers of this open talk, UnILiON, the informal network of 51 university liaison offices here in Brussels, are hosting this, along with UAS for Europe, who I'm representing, an informal network of 450 universities of applied sciences, as well as the Bavarian Research Alliance, who do funding advisory services for Bavarian universities and SMEs, as well as Danske Professionshøjskole, representing all 8 Danish universities of applied sciences. Before handing the word over to Koen, a couple of housekeeping remarks. So the event is recorded and will be published. Questions can be asked written in the chat, so under the questions tag, or orally after raising your hand. So everyone is muted by default. If your hand is raised, we will unmute your microphone remotely, and the camera will, however, remain deactivated. That's the platform that works that way, but you'll be able to interact directly with Koen here today. So just a quick heads up with regard to GDPR guidelines. If you do not want to appear in the recorded video, ask your question in the chat, because there's a separate guideline regarding GDPR agreement for your recording to appear in the event. When asking a question, please add your name and affiliation. And last point, which is often raised, the slides will be distributed after the event with the kind agreement of Koen Numden here today. So with those introductory remarks done, thank you very much for joining us here today, Koen. We look forward to your explanation of the current process regarding the European approach to microcredentials.
Okay, thank you very much, Otto. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session. I am happy that you are here with, I see just over 80 participants. I have prepared a presentation that basically focuses on the Commission proposal for a Council recommendation on microcredentials for lifelong learning and employability. And so I've prepared a presentation of about 25 minutes, I think 25, 30, depends a bit on how that goes. And then it's time for exchange and for discussion. And the organizers were so nice to share the slides for me. Thank you very much. Just a reminder of the background on microcredentials. I think when we look back 5 years, hardly anybody would be talking about microcredentials. This term was not very much in use. It was a bit in use in Oceania, Australia, also New Zealand. New Zealand has a specific framework for microcredentials linked to the New Zealand qualifications framework. But in Europe, not so many people talked about microcredentials. But then, since then, more talk has been taking place, especially also in the field of higher education, and I think in the context of MOOCs, massive open online courses that are provided by typically open universities, but also all sorts of learning platforms. Okay, you now find many things, many MOOCs that are presented in the form of micro-credentials. And given this proliferation of micro-credentials, the Commission also thought that it was a good idea to reflect upon possibilities to come up with a proposal to get to a European approach in order to make sure that micro-credentials that are existing in different contexts, different countries and so on, can be mutually understood, but also in the end can be trusted as a proof of learning, of having certain skills or certain knowledge. And this is how the idea was born to work on this at the European level. This started off with an expert group, mainly focusing on the higher education domain, that was operational in 2020 basically. And then it was taken up by two commissioners, Commissioner Maria Gabriel, in charge of education and research, and Commissioner Nicolas Schmid, who is Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. And they are both responsible commissioners for the current proposal that is on the table and currently of the Council. So negotiations will start de facto as from next week under the French presidency in the Education Committee. And the proposals were announced in, on the one hand, the European Skills Agenda communication that was presented by the Commission on the 1st of July of 2020, and then also by the European Education Area that was also communication adopted in the same year, but in September, and with the aim of achieving a European education area by 2025. Now, next to the skills agenda and European education area communication, in the context of micro-credentials, you have to see that it is also part of the idea of increasing employability of the population, and also of increasing the number of adults that is participating in training. And maybe you are familiar with the European Pillar of Social Rights that was adopted a few years ago, which serves as a compass really for social policies in the EU. And one of its principles, actually the first principle, is about everybody to be entitled to lifelong learning. Last year, action plan was adopted for the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and there a target was fixed, namely that at least 60% of adults should be participating in training every year by 2030. This is quite an ambitious target because currently we are around 40% in Europe. Now, you can go to the next slide. So what are the problems that we aim to address by this proposal? Now, the skills agenda, but also the European education area were, of course, adopted in a period in which there was really two policy priorities together, namely the green transition, the challenges needed by the green transition, but also the digital transition. And then in 2020 came also COVID for the first time. We hope that we have this mostly behind us now, but okay, we never do really know. But this came also in between the preparations we had in 2020 and then adoption of the skills agenda in the middle of 2020. And then I think if we would have written it now, we would have added the Ukrainian refugee crisis, which already has brought 2 million displaced people to the EU. I saw this morning, all those people have, of course, either full qualifications, but many of them are also in the middle of education, children, students, but also probably adults who are in the middle of a learning process. So a challenge really is that a growing number of people need to update their knowledge, skills and competences for these transitions. And we can also say that in order to achieve these transitions, this need for up and reskilling is not just a matter for, let's say, certain groups. It is much broader, and the Commission believes that micro-credentials can play a role here. Now, we see effectively, as I said already before, a rising number of micro-credentials, both globally and in Europe. But the challenge is that their value and the understanding of micro-credentials, and actually what is a micro-credential, is not always clear. There is also a wide range of providers. Of course, I think you are mostly from universities or universities of applied sciences. The concept is relatively well known compared to other sectors, areas of education. But if you look at the de facto definition of what a micro-credential is, it's a concept that is quite widely used also in training for the labor markets. And then, of course, there are questions on quality, on transparency. Quality, can we trust the micro-credentials? What kind of quality mechanisms are behind those? Transparency, can I understand the micro-credential? And also uptake of micro-credentials between and within countries. And is a micro-credential taken in one country? Okay, is it automatically also usable in other countries? But not only between countries, also between sectors and also between jobs. If you move now to the next one. So why micro-credentials? Why the work on micro-credentials? Because they can play a role in these challenges, because they offer targeted and relevant learning that is small in volume and short in duration. And this makes it, of course, attractive for employers if they have staff that need to quickly upskill somewhere. Of course, it's better that this is short in duration of a small volume, rather than that the staff member needs to go 1 or 2 years on a full-time learning assignment. And then also thirdly, there is flexibility of micro-credentials to fit with how people live, how people learn, and also how people work. And one element of this flexibility is that micro-credentials are sometimes online. This is what many people think about micro-credentials. This is online, yes, but they don't need to be online. So the typical example of the online one is, of course, a MOOC, but there are many examples of micro-credentials that are on site, of course. Okay, if we move to the next slide, what is needed to deliver on the potential of micro-credentials? These were questions we were asking ourselves, and we came to the conclusion that if there is EU action that is being proposed by the Commission, then this should focus on supporting a better understanding of micro-credentials. And what is a micro-credential? How can it be understood also in a European context? Secondly, to support transparency, very much linked, because understanding and transparency are both parts of the same picture, I would say. Also, thirdly, to support really trust in micro-credentials, so underpinned by quality assurance and some standards. It's very important. And if you don't have trust in micro-credentials, it's also a bit difficult to role is more difficult to play also in learning mobility and working mobility and so on in the labor market more generally. And then also support uptake of micro-credentials is also, of course, one of the reasons for having EU action. Now, this has resulted in a proposal, all this work in a proposal on micro-credentials. So concretely speaking, a proposal for a council recommendation on a European approach on micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. So these two elements are crucial in the Commission proposal. On the one hand, lifelong learning, meaning it's part of division of lifelong learning for all that is needed at all levels, at university level, but also at other levels, and employability. So supposingly that it contributes really to employability. And here we are very much in the up and reskilling, people staying up to date with their skills in order to be able to follow the requirements of the digital and green transitions, and of course also other transitions that may follow. So a council recommendation Why a council recommendation? You know perhaps that in the area of education and training, in the EU context, education and training is a national policy. The EU cannot adopt any legislation in the proper sense of the word, but what the EU can do is adopt recommendations. And the recommendations, as the treaty says here, are council recommendations, meaning council, governments, and governments basically recommending to member states what to do, but also recommending to the Commission what to do, or to the Commission and member states together. And the institutional procedure of a council recommendation is that the Commission makes a proposal for a council recommendation, which is then sent to the council, so to the member states, and the member states negotiate and agree on the council recommendation. Of course, also in the presence of the Commission. And those negotiations will be starting off next week. The proposal by the Commission was adopted in December of 2021. Now we can go now to the next slide. The objectives of the proposal are, and I will walk you through the proposal, and then after that there is time for questions. The objectives are to enable people to acquire knowledge, skills, competences that they need in the labor market and in society at large, so that they can benefit from a social fair recovery from COVID-19, but also just transitions to the green and digital economy. Then secondly, focus is also on providers of microcredentials, namely to support providers, to enhance the transparency and flexibility of the learning offer in order to empower people to forge personalized training and career pathways. So providers have, of course, an important role to play. Here I want to stress also that it is important to distinguish between a microcredential itself and the learning pathway leading to the microcredential. So in the definition that I will present to you, we have not defined microcredentials as short courses, but of course shorter courses can lead to microcredentials. And then thirdly, to foster inclusiveness and equal opportunities. So you really see that also the resilience, social fairness, social inclusion, and also the demographic changes, all these elements are come into play in the objectives of this proposal on microcredentials. Then if we go to the scope of the proposal, of course, microcredentials, as I said before, are not new, but they are now more in the discussion than before. The microcredentials term is also more used. In order to shape clarity, really the proposal establishes a common European approach to the ongoing and emerging provision of microcredentials. This proposal covers microcredentials themselves, but also the policies that can support their design and that can support their use. Third point, this is very important because if you have a proposal like this, there is of course always fear about what does this mean for the existing system, for the existing provision of education and training, of higher education, but also elsewhere. Of course, this proposal does not seek to disrupt existing systems or to replace existing education systems or existing qualification systems. When you also look de facto at microcredentials, they are more used by adults who have already a basic degree and who use microcredentials after finishing their starting qualification with which they entered into the labor market. So no intention to replace traditional qualifications. However, I think it's unavoidable that the microcredentials landscape as it develops will of course also cause a flexibilization of the overall qualifications landscape. Fourth element of scope here is that the proposal sets out a definition and also some guidance for the design, for the description of microcredentials to facilitate quality, transparency, and uptake. If we now go to the next slide, the proposal itself basically contains a number of building blocks on the one hand, Then it contains recommendations to the member states, to the Commission, and also it contains a focus, a dual focus on active labor market policies on the one hand, and on education, training, and skills policies on the other. And I will now look into some further elements of the proposal, and I will start with the building blocks. So in the building blocks, you see the common definition, the standard elements, and the principles for design and issuance of micro-credentials. Now, first of all, and we had a lot of discussion about, also in the expert group, in the open public consultation, about, okay, what are micro-credentials? And we thought that it was very important that the Council recommendation proposal contains a common definition of micro-credentials. And the definition that you see here is really the result of very long discussions with many different stakeholders. And yeah, this is now the proposal, of course, of the Commission, and we will see to which extent this definition will survive. I believe it's quite strong because it's quite complete regarding the different elements. Now, there is a first phrase in the definition, which is a bit the shorter definition, and then there is a second phrase, and altogether this makes the longer definition, I would say. But if you go for the short definition, there you see that a micro-credential means a record. So it's a sort of documentation of learning outcomes that the learner has acquired following a small volume of learning. And these learning outcomes have been assessed against standards. So you see here elements of the definition of qualification are coming back in the definition of what is a micro-credential. So the learning outcomes really is key, but these learning outcomes are not just self-declared. No, they must have been assessed. And they must have been assessed, of course, against a benchmark, namely standards, like for normal qualification. What is, of course, particular in micro-credentials here is that this concerns a small volume. So the volume of the credential is not reflecting usually 2 or 3 or 4 years or whatsoever of study, but a smaller volume. However, there is no standard small volume that is part of the definition, and that would also not be compatible with the situation that we find in education and training, and also in the labor market landscapes. Then secondly, if we go to the bottom part, really there you can see elements like specific knowledge. It's not just general knowledge. No, micro-credentials focus on specific skills, specific competence, on specific knowledge, responding to certain needs. Yeah. Then another point is that micro-credentials are owned by the learner. So we see more and more, of course, that credentials, when they are received by people, are digital credentials. And it is very important, we believe, that if an individual receives a digital credential, of course, the individual must be the owner of that digital credential. And it's the individual who decides with whom and when to share this micro-credential. Another element is portability. It's very important that the micro-credential is portable between countries, but also between sectors. And then a point is that micro-credentials can be standalone. For example, a standalone MOOC of 6 or 10 ECTS, but, and this is important in the lifelong learning context, of course, would not be bad if it also could be combined together with other micro-credentials into a larger credential, and perhaps contribute also to achieving a full degree. Of course, this is an area where sometimes higher education establishments start to become a bit skeptical, saying, yeah, but we should not disrupt. No. So the principle is, of course, also that this proposal is not disrupting existing systems. It's not replacing, it's not aiming at replacing existing systems. But we see already in some countries that students have quite a lot of freedom to combine, of course, their degree. And one of the potential assets also I would see in micro-credentials is that you could even more flexibly combine modules from different universities. And this is also, I think, why European university alliances are interested in micro-credentials. Final point is, of course, quality assurance. Without quality, there is no trust, and it's important that quality is made transparent. Now, things got in the higher education field. There are the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance in higher education. However, these only apply to the higher education field and not really outside. In vocational education training, there is the ECAVET framework, which is a toolbox. And of course, you have also other international quality standards. So this quality assurance is, of course, a key element, and that's why it is part of the definition. If we go to the other elements of the building block, I will go a bit faster. On the one hand, there are the standard elements to describe a micro-credential. All these elements are important to know. They contribute to transparency, to the understanding of the micro-credential. To have these elements is really key also to be able to trust the micro-credential. And if all micro-credentials comply with and have this information linked to them, it's easier for employers, for individuals, for education and training institutions to understand them. So on the one hand, you see here elements on the left that should always be present, which is normal: the learning outcomes, the awarding body, notional workload when it's available, level, and also elements of optional information like the grade achieved, like also stackability options. So can you combine micro-credentials into larger credentials? And then the other building block are the principles for the design, and this is on the next slide. The design of an issuance of micro-credentials, and here you see the principles: quality, transparency, relevance, pathways, recognition also is important, of course, and also it should be possible to obtain, of course, a micro-credential after a certain learning pathway that has been designated, of course, but also we believe that it should be possible to obtain micro-credentials based on an assessment of skills. If you have already the learning outcomes of a micro-credentials, why would it be necessary to do a course if also an assessment of your learning outcomes could prove that you have those learning outcomes? Why wouldn't you, in that case, not simply receive the micro-credential? Okay, now I'm moving forward to the recommendations, and that's on the next slide. So these recommendations altogether consist of recommendations to the member states. I will come to those here, and also recommendations to the Commission in the form of Commission support. Now, first, when we talk about recommendations to member states are invited to adopt the micro-credentials definition. Now, this is good by de facto already by agreeing. If they do on the Council recommendation, of course, we expect that member states, if they have committed politically to that definition of micro-credentials, we would also expect them to adopt the micro-credentials definition as it is and not to develop an own definition. Secondly, to adopt also the standard elements. They don't fall out of the air. They are inspired, for example, by the recommendation on the European Qualifications Framework for Lifelong Learning that very much uses the same standards when it talks about exchange of electronic information about qualifications. And also the other element is to adopt the principles for design and issuance. So I showed these three elements. And then there are more specific recommendations, namely to develop an ecosystem for micro-credentials and also to deliver on the potential of micro-credentials. And finally, to implement, of course, micro-credentials in a national context. If you go to the next slide, we see elements of these ecosystems. Because in the end, as a matter of fact, if you look at the ecosystem around qualifications and around micro-credentials, you have many parties. You have the providers, you have quality assurance agencies, you have catalogs of information about where do micro-credentials exist. There is an element of skills intelligence, knowing, okay, what are skills needs in certain sectors based, for example, on job vacancy trends. And there is also validation or recognition of prior learning. There is, of course, also the social dialogue, because micro-credentials can be important chunks of training needed for certain labor market staff developments, for skill development, and also the national qualification frameworks are important because they are also a bit challenged through micro-credentials. I mean, national frameworks often have as a purpose to make qualifications transparent. More and more national frameworks do now also include qualifications offered by the private sector through industry. They have to position themselves, these national frameworks, in relation to micro-credentials. How do they see this? How do micro-credentials fit, and how do they relate to full qualifications? Is it useful to provide specific measures of transparency and maybe a level to micro-credentials? Or does the national framework say, we believe this is not needed? So a lot of discussion there also needs to go on. If we go to the next slide, when we talk about the ecosystems for micro-credentials, we see, and in the proposal, there is a distinction that is made between, let's say, the formal learning setting of micro-credentials and also the non-formal, informal learning setting. And then thirdly, of course, a specific focus there in the ecosystem on quality and transparency. Regarding formal learning, really the proposal is there and invites member states to explore micro-credentials, their use by European university alliances, for example. These are explicitly mentioned, but also the centers for vocational excellence in vocational education and training. Then also explicitly, the proposal refers to providers outside the formal sector, employers, social partners, civil society organizations, local government. Also, those parties are offering training, and they offer also training for micro-credentials, if you follow the definition. There is also the need for social dialogue, as I said before, and RPL processes. How do universities see micro-credentials? Do they apply existing RPL processes that are sometimes a bit complex, but how do they deal with this? If somebody comes and says, I've done a micro-credential, I would like to have an exemption for this one for my studies. And then there is quality transparency. Of course, quality mechanisms for micro-credentials, for their delivery is important. And I already referred to the standards and guidelines, but also it should be important that providers publish also catalogs of micro-credentials so that users see which micro-credentials are available. And then last point, I already referred to it, member states should start discussions about integration of micro-credentials in national qualification frameworks or not. I mean, they have to start at least this discussion, and they have to consider the relevance that they see in this. If we go to the next slide, we see a bit what the proposal suggests in terms of education, training, and skills policies. So it invites clearly to include micro-credentials in national catalogs of courses. Now, I will come to the European level later. Also, it can have a role in improving access to education and training for all learners. So education and training is quite a big role to play also in achieving this target of adult learning. Also, they can support the transition from upper secondary or vocational to tertiary education. They can play a role in improving digital skills, in acquiring the digital skills that are needed and the digital transition. So everybody actually needs digital skills at work. And there are a few other elements mentioned here that come from the proposal that I will not address in particular because time is also running. Then we go to the active labor market policies, also being addressed in the proposal. This is the next slide. So Commission thinks that it would be useful if member states would address micro-credentials in the context of skill mismatches that they have or bottlenecks that they have in certain economic sectors. We see now before the Ukrainian crisis, very much in the news, was the fact that, okay, we are recovering now from COVID, but suddenly one sees, okay, here are many deficits. Here are deficits in staff. No personnel there is nobody that can fill jobs. Then, of course, for upskilling and reskilling, for in-demand skills and jobs, green digital transitions, but of course also other sectors. And then also, and here is the interconnection with another proposal that the Commission tabled in December of last year, namely that member states should set up individual learning accounts for individuals. And in this context, in the context of that proposal, also member states will be invited to set up national registries of training opportunities linked to individual learning accounts. And of course, a typical case example there could be a micro-credential as a way, short-term, specific skills to provide a learning opportunity to individuals under those individual learning accounts. Also there to support self-employed, to support non-standard workers who have a bit less automatic chance of getting the right training. And there you see some other policy links to the youth guarantee, also to the active labor market support recommendation. And of course, microcredentials should be there and can be used also to meet regulatory requirements for jobs and for work. Now let's move now towards a bit more the end of the presentation. So there is a next slide that looks at member states implementation. So the council recommendation is asking member states to implement the council recommendation, to define measures building on national arrangements that already are there, but also to make available national resource allocations for uptake of microcredentials, to also see how it addresses microcredentials in connection with individual learning accounts, so the other Commission proposal, but also very much to make best use of available union instruments. And we all know, thanks to in the context of the COVID crisis in 2020, recovery resilience facility was put in place with very high level of funding, EU funding available to get out of the crisis. So the proposal calls upon member states also to seek what type of union funding it can use. And of course, at national level, you need also to carry out some reforms, have an enabling framework, and so on. Then we can move to Commission support. So the proposal also contains Commission support. That is on the next slide. And the proposal is asking the Commission to look into existing EU tools. What should be adapted? So, and concretely speaking, this means looking at the Bologna tools. For example, the ECTS user guide, does it need to be adapted in order to cope with micro-credentials? It also looks in the role of ANIC-NARIC centers, so academic recognition centers, regarding the recognition of micro-credentials. Also, the Commission will develop some guidance notes to member states on how to see micro-credentials in connection with national frameworks. Then support also cooperation between member states and stakeholders. That's a role of the Commission. We will promote cooperation on quality assurance around micro-credentials, and also support European universities, etc., in use of micro-credentials, but also make sure that there is exchange of best practice between, for example, public employment services. Then another point is technical implementation through Europass. So there is a Europass platform that was put in place by the Commission also in through the skills agenda, but it started in 2020. And in this context, there is a sharing of information on learning opportunities. Member states are invited to share learning opportunities already, but if they develop course registers and so on, the micro-credentials, it would be interesting also to share these at European level, and this can be done through the Europass platform, so that also every citizen can look in an easy way at micro-credentials in different countries, Then secondly, digital credentialing is also a service that is offered through the Europass platform, could also be used, of course, for giving credentials to, or an official learning credential to holders of micro-credentials. And thirdly, we will work in Europass on the development of a stacker that would allow to collect and to accumulate micro-credentials in a technical way in the context of Europass. The last point I would like to address is that it's very important to do more research, more data collection is needed. We don't have a full picture of what is ongoing, and I'm sure that in the next years there will be a rising trend of microcredentials. I don't believe that this will stop. So there is a continuous need for further research and data collection. And with this slide, I actually would like to stop. So in the documentation, I added a few slides which I thought were interesting. They come from a study that colleagues from CEDEFOP, and I think one colleague from CEDEFOP is also present in today's event, from a study that they have been carrying out, and I'm sharing some key findings from the survey program that was done. So there was a big survey among employers, all sorts of stakeholders in the labor market regarding micro-credentials. And then if you just skip go to the next slide and to the next one and to the one after. Yes, and still another one. Yes, I would like to finish with this one. No, just one slide before, please. This is namely a survey carried out among employer organizations in Germany. And here, in a nutshell, a result of this survey is that micro-credentials are evidence of practical, flexible, on-demand, and short learning experience. This is what makes them so attractive. Common European standards must preserve the attractiveness and not limit it through over-regulation and over-formalization. It is central to find a good balance, appropriate balance between fostering trust and transparency as part of a common approach without compromising the flexibility of micro-credentials. I would like to finish with this quote. You have these slides also on empirical evidence, so I'm thinking my colleague from CEDEFOP would send them to me. You have them in your documentation, but we have no time to go into them. I already talked too long, I think, Otto, and now ready to reply to questions or to enter into a discussion.
Otto, I assume you are muted.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Koen, for that presentation. If time wasn't a constraint, we would happily listen to you for another half hour. Yes, we're joined now by Tim, my colleague from the BIFOR office here. So we'll kind of throw the ball back and forth in terms of managing the questions coming in from the audience. I can see in the question panel, we already have a couple. If you would like to ask them directly, of course, I remind you of the GDPR guideline, which asks us to, ask for you only to ask your question if you agree to this appearing in the recording that will be published afterwards. So I think we can take the questions that exist in the panel already. Hans Dahle, can we give Hans Dahle the microphone? Or we can ask the question for you directly if you prefer, but we will unmute your microphone.
Just a second. Yeah.
Can we find them? Because we need to go through the.
Let's maybe read it out loud, because that's going to be too long otherwise.
Okay, so we'll read Hans Dahle's question. I can't see the whole question. Maybe Tim, you can take it.
Yeah. So the question is related to stakeholder representation and stakeholder reaction in particular. And so the question by Hans Dahle is, I'm just going to read it out loud. It's probably the simplest way. How are employers' organizations reacting to these ideas and proposals? And from what I read out of the question, the skepticism, or maybe the perceived skepticism, is turning about whether or not there will be more bureaucracy.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Hans, for this question. Okay, there is this quote which I found fairly interesting, but from all the experiences that I have read and seen, and also in consultations that were carried out in the course of 2020 and also 2021, I think that my impression has always been that employer organizations are reasonably positive about the potential of micro-credentials. The only fear they have expressed indeed sometimes is that if there are European standards, or if there is a European approach, or if there is discussion regarding the inclusion of micro-credentials in national frameworks, okay, you should not kill micro-credentials, the benefits themselves, by adding layers of bureaucracy. For me, this is very much, so for me, they have a positive stance towards micro-credentials, generally speaking, but okay, it's up to the member states to make sure in implementation that, for example, if there is a possibility for having micro-credentials in national frameworks, that there is an opt-in rather than an imposition. Yeah, so it's very important, is also my opinion, to keep the flexibility around micro-credentials without, however, compromising quality and trust. And maybe we can just on the slide, because this focus is really on a particular quote, we can just also put my title slide if you wish, or finish it. I don't mind.
Yeah, I'll let Tim change the slide while I'll move on to the next question, which comes from Stefan Hampel. I see he's not in the meeting, but I'll ask the question on his behalf now. So the question is, who, as in what institution, will be in charge of quality assurance? Will there be a central EU quality assurance agency for micro-credentials, or just national ones?
Okay, so there will be no EU central quality assurance agency that will be established. So the quality assurance landscape as it is now will stay. I mean, you have national agencies, but that apply the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance when we talk about higher education. So this will stay like that. What will be done is to check also, because this is a Bologna framework tool, whether this European standards and guidelines can do the job also of quality assurance of micro-credentials. But no European level institution, European level quality assurance agency. No institutional development yet.
That's very clear. Tim, do you want to take the next one?
I'll take the next one. The questions are coming in. We have another one by Magdalena Pacholska. How will the EU framework embrace the micro-credentials delivered by the US or UK universities? So beyond the European Union.
Yeah. I mean, this is a reality which is there, and I don't think, I mean, how this is being dealt with, of course, depends on when we take, for example, the case of recognition. This is really up to European universities to deal with that, or to member states to deal with that. So the proposal doesn't say anything about whether micro-credentials are from UK or US. It more focuses on principles. But as a matter of fact, of course, many MOOCs are provided through UK platforms or through American platforms, and also are through providers from those countries. But the same principles, I mean, you cannot impose principles on micro-credentials, okay? We also must see here, we live in the environment of a council recommendation, so there is no EU law that already makes that the system is flexible. Yeah, they are, for me, if you ask me, they are micro-credentials. They have a very, very useful role, of course, in the up and reskilling. Yeah? So the focus should be there on learning outcomes, of course. That is crucial. And if people have a micro-credential from the US, of course, you add this to your lifelong learning portfolio. It's probably a crucial element. So yeah, not so much we can say about that really in the context of this proposal.
So I understand that the micro-credential agenda now focuses on within the supporting competence of the European Union on streamlining or harmonizing micro-credentials within the European Union before maybe after that reaching out or broadening the scope to beyond European borders?
Yeah, but there is one thing. So as you saw in the presentation, we have, I mean, the proposal suggests to adopt these standard elements to describe a micro-credential. It's proposing a common definition of a micro-credential. It's proposing also union principles for the design and issuance of micro-credentials. But you also see that the definition, there is no fixed description of what are the concrete requirements of a micro-credential in terms of volume, in terms of, you see, so the proposal comes with broader principles, and they aim really to enhance the transparency and the understanding of micro-credentials. So if micro-credentials are indeed formulated in terms of those standard elements, if they are described in those standard elements, they will contribute to more transparency of micro-credentials. That's the purpose, because then they are hopefully more trusted, and especially if the quality assurance is there, and this is a well-known system and complies with, for example, the European standards and guidelines when we talk about higher education. This can help to increase trust in micro-credentials. Yeah. So this is how you have to see that council recommendation. Right?
Understood. Thanks, Koen, for the clarification. And Otto, the ball is back in your field.
Thank you, Tim. A quick question from Bernard Kaliki. Will there be a library of micro-credentials?
Yeah, so the idea is, of course, that member states also set up these catalogs of micro-credentials. And I think it would be very useful if these different national initiatives, that information on micro-credentials, when that could also be shared at European level, for example, through the Europass platform, because then you would have a central entry point to these different national catalogs. So we are exploring this already in Europass, how to see it. But if you want to interconnect those micro-credentials, you need that. What is a requirement is that these micro-credentials are not formulated, but are using data structures that are compatible. So we have a data structure at European level, which is called the European Learning Model. It's very much compatible with the EU standard elements to describe a micro-credential. So if all micro-credentials use those categories for describing them, then you can also share them at European level and show the richness of information also at European level, you know, through a single, through one entry. It would be great if these different catalogs could be interconnected and are accessible to any user anywhere in Europe.
Yeah, that's a very promising architecture. Thank you very much. And back to you, Tim.
We have a question that links very well to that, I think, in the area of recognition and portability by Anja Kustas. So a formal degree is valid for life. What do you think about the lifespan or the duration, the validity of micro-credentials?
Okay. In the in the domain of learning, of course, and if there is no link to the one or the other formal license, yeah, then micro-credentials, I believe, will not see limits in validity, because you can say the same. You have a formal degree, yeah, in a certain topic, but if you acquired it in the 70s or 80s of the last century, it's probably also the fact that that knowledge maybe is not anymore up to date with now, but your degree is still valid. So I think that we can say for most micro-credentials, this will be exactly the same. It may be, if they are linked to concrete licensing that is given for a couple of years, of course, you would probably need to renew, but this is industry sector related. This is related to national regulations when they exist and are relevant.
Otto.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the next question, there's a quick question from Martin Staudinger where he can see the questions and how he can take part in the discussion. So you can add your question exactly where you've asked this more administrative question in the same box. The next content question comes from Luce Rutten. Could you elaborate on the foreseen support on the European level for coordination between stakeholders and member states?
Yeah, so the European support that is there is multiple, because the Commission will support cooperation between member states in the area of quality assurance of micro-credentials. So then you have to think about facilitating discussions also on that topic. Also in relation to European universities, VET centers of excellence, also in the context of the blueprints, the Pact for Skills and Linked Cooperation initiatives, also peer learning around micro-credentials and so on. The proposal does not really reserve an envelope of financial support, for development. It puts the ball a bit more towards the member states, because there is so much EU funding available, but also methodological support. How to, the Commission will reflect on EU and Bologna instruments. Are they fit? But also other EU transparency instruments. How fit are they to cope with micro-credentials, like the recent recommendation on vocational education and training? Also, this European Student Card Initiative will be supported by the Commission. And here the point is to allow students to share the outcomes of micro-credentials if they do this in the context of mobility, and to do that in a secure way with other education and training institutions. So those are elements of support. Yeah, the Commission will have here a facilitating role. The ball is very much in the hands of member states, and I would also say in the hands of education and training and other and private training institutions. But what the Commission will also do is to support further research on uptake of this European approach, on also the development of micro-credentials, because we need to know a bit more. So even if we have this council recommendation now, this is also a process of work that is enshrined into that proposal for a council recommendation, and I'm sure it will be discussed and also analyzed in relevant circles and experts. And also I mean, there is a lot of work around micro-credentials during the next years. We don't know how the picture is evolving, but the main purpose really here is to create some structure, some standard element, etc., a common definition, in order to get some structure in this landscape of proliferation of micro-credentials.
Thank you very much, Koen. I think we if we're going to be strict, we need to stop this session there. Thank you already for the details you've provided on what is a very exciting process. You can see how interesting it is just by all the engagement we're getting from the questions in the audience. Could I ask you, Koen, if we can follow up with questions for you in written form with all those questions from the people who haven't been able to ask them in the session?
Yeah, any unanswered questions during the session, I'm happy to follow these up. We are also, I must say, working in the Commission between DG Education and Culture and between DG Ample on microcredentials. It's 2 commissioners, but these 2 commissioners are responsible for also different services within the Commission. And I will follow up then with my colleagues, and happy to provide written answers to the remaining questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your contributions here today, and thank you for the audience for all their strong engagement. And thanks to Tim and our colleagues in the back office for the smooth running of today's session. So thank you very much. This was highly successful, I think, and highly informative on a very exciting process. And we hope the next steps are moving forward as well as it seems the process has happened so far. So thank you very much, Koen, and thank you very much to all the audience for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.